Have you ever stopped to think how much a simple gesture can change your life? Something so small, almost imperceptible, but that can make everything around you fall apart or take a completely unexpected turn. That's exactly what happened that day, and no one there knew what was about to happen. But before I continue, I ask you, what would you do if, on your first day at work, you were going to do something completely normal, like handing your boss a letter, and this generated a completely disproportionate reaction? And what's more, what would you do if, when you approached a superior, he was afraid even of your touch? Stay with me because you'll understand. Foster Enterprises was never just any company. Dylan Carter, the CEO, had a quirk that everyone at the company knew. He didn't tolerate any kind of physical contact. Nothing, not even a handshake. But Julia, newly hired and clueless about this, could hardly have imagined that her first day at work would be marked by a simple touch, something that would turn her life upside down. It was a normal day for her, like any other at the beginning of a new professional phase. She was anxious, yes, but nothing that went beyond simple excitement. Until Emma, Dylan's secretary, asked her to go to her boss's locker room to get a tie. A simple request which should have been just a work routine. But when she entered the locker room, Julia felt a slight sensation that something was not right. The furtive glances from the other employees, the air of expectation. She was about to be placed at the center of something bigger, without even knowing it. Julia had never felt so watched in her life. She stood there, with the ties in her hands, trying to decide which one Dylan would prefer, and every second she felt that something was going to happen, but she didn't know what. Those curious eyes of her co-workers, the low murmurs in the hallway, everything seemed to be conspiring for her to make a mistake. She could barely understand what was wrong in that environment, but the fear began to grow as she approached the door to Dylan's office. What could be so bad? What could she have done wrong? A simple gesture. She had no idea that it would change everything. Her heart racing, Julia knocked on Dylan's office door and walked in. There he was, Dylan Carter, the feared CEO of Foster Enterprises, adjusting his sleeve, his expression a mix of impatience and authority. He looked at her but said nothing, just waited, as if waiting for an action. Those strings, all the options she had brought were somehow there for him to choose from, and she felt, with every movement, a growing tension, as if she were about to be tested in ways she had never imagined. When she handed him the corbatas, Dylan looked at her critically, as if he had noticed every detail of her behavior, as if he was looking for something there, something that not even she knew she should do. "This one has flamencos," he said, without much emotion, when he saw a blue corbata with a flashy pattern. Julia, embarrassed, took another one, but before she could hand it over, he interrupted her with a simple gesture, an expression of slight discomfort. Then Julia, feeling nervous, moved closer to help him adjust the corbata, without thinking much about the gesture. And that was when everything changed. The touch on her neck was gentle, but Dylan's reaction was immediate and almost explosive. He jumped back, as if he'd been struck by an electric shock. The air grew thick between them, and Julia didn't know what was happening. What could she have done that was so wrong? Dylan looked pale, his eyes wide, and an uncomfortable silence fell over the room. "You touched me," he said, his voice tight with a mixture of anger and fear. "But why? What was happening here?" Julia, completely stunned, tried to understand, but he wouldn't let her speak. "Don't do that again," was all he could say before turning her around and walking out of the office. Julia pulled away, not understanding what had just happened. Her reaction made no sense at all. She was just trying to help, but the fear in Dylan's eyes, the stiffness of his body, spoke of something much deeper than simple discomfort. Little did she know, but that simple gesture, which seemed so trivial, had touched something inside Dylan, something he had been hiding from everyone, and now, more than ever, Julia felt part of something much bigger, something she couldn't simply ignore. At that moment, Julia stood in the hallway, feeling the tension in the air. The conversations continued quietly around her, but she couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. What's wrong with him? Why did he act like that? There was no logical explanation, but something told her that this moment wasn't just another rookie mistake. Dylan's reaction wasn't a simple, "Don't touch me." It was real fear, and that intrigued her even more. She wasn't just dealing with an eccentric boss. There was something behind all that coldness. The rest of the day was a game of hide and seek. Julia tried to avoid Dylan as much as possible. When their eyes met, there was a silence between them, a heavy discomfort, as if she had touched an open wound he was trying desperately to hide. But she couldn't, and didn't want to, forget what had happened. Every time she came across him, something inside her pushed her to know more. Something in Dylan was screaming for help, and she knew it was only a matter of time before she found out what it was. And then, at the end of that day, she got the news she hadn't expected. Emma hurried in, her expression serious, and announced that Dylan wanted to see her in his office. Julia's heart sank. She knew this moment had arrived, the moment of truth. She didn't know what to expect, but she was determined not to leave without an explanation, not after everything that had happened. She needed to understand what was behind that fear. Julia took a deep breath and headed to Dylan's office, knowing that her life at the firm would never be the same again. Julia walked into Dylan's office, trying to remain calm, even though her heart was pounding. He had his back to her, staring out the window, as usual, his posture rigid and unwavering. When she entered, he didn't turn around immediately. The tension in the air was palpable, and Julia felt the weight of every second that passed in silence. It was strange, because even with all the coldness that emanated from him, she knew he was expecting something from her. And she didn't know if it was an apology, an explanation, or, worse yet, a punishment for having violated the unspoken rule that governed his behavior. "Sit down, Julia," was all he said when he finally turned his head, his eyes filled with something Julia couldn't quite decipher. He didn't look angry, but the tiredness in his eyes made it clear that what had happened that morning was still on his mind. Julia walked over to the chair, but before she sat down, she looked at him. "You're not going to send me to Greenland, are you?" she joked, trying to ease the tension. Dylan didn't smile. He didn't seem to laugh at anything lately. "No, it's not about that," he said, his tone low and controlled. The silence stretched for a moment until Dylan began to speak. "You touched me today." Julia felt a chill run down her spine. He wasn't angry or even embarrassed, but something in his voice was broken. As if that touch, that simple gesture, was so much more than just a violation of her rules. "I know, I don't know what happened, I just wanted to help," Julia said, trying to explain. But he cut her off, in a voice she never imagined she'd hear from him. "You don't understand. I can't be touched." Those words hung in the air like a bombshell. Julia was silent, trying to process what he had said. What did he mean by that? She had touched other people in her life, with a simple handshake, or even a friendly gesture. But here he was, a successful man with immense power, telling her that he could not be touched. She realized in that moment that his reaction was not just about a rule, but about something deeper, something he was hiding from everyone. Dylan closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength to continue. Julia sat, watching intently, but not daring to make any move that might trigger another reaction like that. The mood was tense, but there was a vulnerability in Dylan that Julia hadn't expected to see. He looked fragile somehow, as if he were fighting something inside himself, something he didn't want to admit, but that was about to come out. "It's not just a touch," he said finally, his voice lower. I can't let anyone touch me because it reminds me of something I can't forget." Julia was in shock. His words hit her like a wave, and at the same time she felt an empathy she never imagined she would feel for him. She had never imagined that the powerful, untouchable Dylan Carter would be someone with such deep trauma. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw something there that made her question everything she had thought about him. The man everyone had considered distant and unreachable was actually struggling with very real pain, something he didn't know how to overcome. "I'm just one person," Dylan continued, his voice weaker now. "But it seems like all my past, everything I've tried to hide, always comes back to haunt me. The feeling of being touched brings me back to a dark place I don't want anyone to see." Julia swallowed, and for a moment she felt like she was facing something much bigger than a simple corporate rule. Dylan wasn't just running away from physical touch. He was running away from his own memories, from a pain he couldn't control. And it was in that moment, as Dylan looked at her with a mixture of fear and confusion, that Julia made a decision. She didn't know what had happened to him to make him react that way, but one thing she was sure of: he couldn't go on living like this. Something inside her told her that even if he tried to push her away, she wouldn't give in. Not now. Not when she knew he needed someone to help him face what was hidden behind his rigidity, his obsession with control. Julia took a deep breath and slowly stood up, feeling the weight of the moment. She didn't know how, but something inside her urged her not to give up on Dylan. Even without fully understanding the depth of his pain, she knew he wasn't asking for help, but she also knew he needed her in a way he couldn't express. "I'm not going to force you to talk," she said, with a calmness that surprised even herself. "But if you want, I can listen." Dylan was silent for a moment, and for a moment Julia thought he wasn't going to answer. His eyes were fixed on the floor, as if he was struggling with the words, trying to find a way to open up. I'm not an easy person to deal with," he said, his voice lower, now almost a whisper. "I'm good at controlling everything around me, but when someone breaks that barrier, I don't know what to do." Julia took a step toward him but stopped before she could touch him. She knew he wasn't ready for another touch, but her presence seemed to be enough for the moment. She understood that what Dylan needed wasn't immediate solutions, but someone who was willing to not give up on him. He had spent his entire life building walls, controlling his reality to keep the pain and fear from reaching him. But now, in front of her, he was at a breaking point, and the only thing he really wanted deep down was someone who would accept him with all his imperfections. "You don't have to be perfect," Julia said with a softness that seemed to fill the room. "I don't expect that from you. I just hope you'll let me try to help." Dylan looked at her, his eyes finally meeting hers. His gaze was filled with a mixture of confusion, exhaustion, and something Julia couldn't quite place. Maybe it was a silent apology, or maybe it was the beginning of something more. But in that moment, Julia knew he wasn't trying to hide anymore. He was beginning to give in, to allow her to get closer, even if it was in a way he couldn't control. And that, to her, was a big step forward. The next few days were strange, as if a delicate balance had been established between them. Dylan still maintained his barriers, but something had changed. Julia, for her part, felt more connected to him than she had ever imagined. She continued to do her job, but now, whenever they passed each other in the hallways, there was something different in the air. He no longer avoided her gaze, and somehow Julia felt that he was trying to open up, even if only a little at a time. But even though the atmosphere was calmer, the tension between them didn't completely disappear. Julia knew that there was still much more behind that aversion to touch, something he didn't want or didn't know how to tell her. And even though she tried not to get too involved, the curiosity to understand what made him so closed off and insecure began to take over her. How could someone so imposing, so controlling, be so fragile when it came to a simple gesture of affection? She needed to understand, and she was willing to do whatever it took. It was one afternoon while she was organizing some documents that something strange happened. Julia turned the corner of the hallway and accidentally bumped into Dylan. The coffee she was carrying flew straight onto his shirt, staining it a dark brown. The sound of the liquid hitting the clothes seemed to echo throughout the entire company. Everyone around her stopped, as if they were watching a death sentence being announced. Panic took over Julia. No, it can't be. Not again, she thought. But what happened was even more surprising. Dylan, who had always been in complete control, simply stopped. He looked down at the coffee dripping down his shirt, and, instead of exploding like she expected, he just stood there, motionless. Julia didn't know what to do, but before she could apologize, he looked at her, and a strange expression formed on his face. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper, perhaps a silent acceptance that, at this moment, he was about to face yet another of his limitations. "You're going to pay me for the cleaning, aren't you?" he asked, but the slight irony in his voice didn't hide the feeling that perhaps this incident was actually a small step towards him beginning to allow himself to be less perfect. Julia, still in shock, smiled awkwardly. "Sure, I'll pay for the cleaning," she replied, trying to hide her tension with a smile. But what surprised her most was the fact that Dylan didn't react as she had imagined. He didn't seem angry, or even angry with himself. There was something different about his posture. He was still rigid, but in a more human, more vulnerable way. The cold, implacable expression had softened a little, as if this simple disaster had opened a small crack in his fortitude. They went to Dylan's office, where the atmosphere was thick with tension that they both tried to ignore. But the fact that Julia hadn't been fired after everything that had happened made her think more about the situation. Something was changing, and Dylan couldn't hide it anymore. He was starting to give in, to accept that maybe absolute control over everything around him wasn't what he really wanted. When she came into his office to talk about the accident, he was more relaxed than usual, even hiding a small smile as if he was trying to convince himself that everything was okay. But deep down, she knew he was just postponing the inevitable. When Julia approached to talk about the incident, Dylan interrupted her, saying something that took her by surprise. "I know you're probably wondering why I react this way, why with just one touch, everything spirals out of control." Julia looked at him, and, for the first time, she felt that he was starting to open up even a little. But she couldn't push him. Not yet. She knew he had to get there on his own. "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to," Julia said softly. "But if you ever do, I'll be here." Dylan watched her for a moment, and it seemed like something was struggling inside him. He was about to speak, but something stopped him. He sighed and went back to his computer. "Let's save that for later," he said, more to himself than to her, but what Julia understood was that he wasn't as closed off as he had been. There was a small sign that maybe he was ready to confront his own fears, and maybe one day take the next step toward actually letting someone get close to him. The rest of the afternoon passed with a strange normality, as if the coffee incident had been some kind of silent test. Julia noticed that Dylan seemed more attentive to her afterward, without his usual aloofness. It wasn't a radical change, but it was progress, a small step toward mutual understanding. The feeling that he saw her in a different light was there, but he wasn't ready to admit it yet. Over the next few days, Dylan began to act differently. He still maintained his unbeatable CEO facade, but Julia began to notice small changes. During meetings, he didn't avoid her as much. When she spoke, he listened more attentively. It was almost as if he was trying to figure out if he could trust her, or perhaps wondering if she would be able to handle the complexities of his world. But beneath these subtle changes, there was a play of caution, as if he still worried that any gesture could upset the fragile balance that was beginning to form. Then one day, at the end of an important meeting, Dylan asked to speak to Julia. She didn't know what to expect, but her heart started beating faster as soon as the door to the room closed behind them. "I need you," he said bluntly, something that, to him, seemed like a request for vulnerability. Julia looked at him in surprise. It was the first time he had expressed himself so directly. "I need you to help me with something." She approached, knowing that this request wasn't about a simple job. "What do you need, Dylan?" He took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to open up in a way he never had before. "I don't know how to explain it, but you've been challenging me to change. I can't go on like this. I need to deal with what's behind all of this, and you might be the only person who won't abandon me." Julia felt something deep take hold of her when she heard those words. He was asking for help, not just from an assistant, but from someone he believed could help him face his deepest fears. Julia stared at Dylan, taking in his words. He was standing there, vulnerable in a way she never imagined she would see. And more than that, he was allowing himself to accept her help. That, in itself, was a huge step. She knew he had spent years, maybe decades, trying to maintain control over everything around him. The rigidity, the lack of affection, the aversion to touch. It was all part of a defense mechanism created to protect something he didn't want or didn't know how to face. "I don't know where to begin," Dylan continued, his voice filled with a raw honesty that Julia wasn't used to hearing from him. He was falling apart in front of her, something that had seemed impossible until now. "My whole life, everything has been about control. If I let anyone touch me and really know me, I'd lose everything." He paused, looking at her with an intensity that seemed almost desperate. "But I'm starting to realize that without this, I'm not really living, and I don't know what to do with that." Julia approached, feeling immense compassion for this man who seemed so distant but who, there in front of her, seemed completely lost. "You don't have to do this alone, Dylan," she said firmly, yet with a touch of softness. "I'm not asking you to change overnight. But maybe it's time to start facing the fears you have, and that won't be easy, but I'll be here to help." She smiled, trying to show that she wasn't pressuring him, just offering the support he clearly needed, even if he didn't know how to ask for it. Dylan looked at her, and for the first time she saw a genuine weakness in his eyes, a need for support that he'd previously hidden behind his unbeatable CEO facade. "I never thought it was possible. I never imagined someone like you so open would be able to make me see that," he said, his tone a mix of disbelief and faint gratitude. He wasn't pulling away from her anymore. If anything, there was something in his posture that suggested he was finally allowing someone to get close. "Then let's take the first step together," Julia replied, the confidence in her words something new to her as well. She had never imagined she would become so involved with her boss, but something about that connection, that moment, made her feel like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. And for Dylan, maybe this was the beginning of something even deeper than he could understand. Over the next few days, Julia noticed a significant change in Dylan's behavior. He was still the same demanding CEO, with his perfectionism and unwavering control. But something was different. There was an openness, a lightness, that she had never seen before. Their conversations began to flow more easily. He no longer avoided eye contact, and sometimes when their hands accidentally brushed, he didn't immediately pull away, as he had before. It was as if he was allowing himself to breathe, albeit hesitantly. The truth was that Dylan was beginning to face what he feared most: touch, closeness, vulnerability. He had never known how to handle it, never known how to let someone into his space without feeling like he was losing control. But slowly, with Julia's patience, he began to understand that true strength came not from being rigid, but from being able to open up, to let someone in without fear. But the real test for Dylan came one day when, during an important meeting, something happened that no one expected. Julia was by his side, helping to organize documents, when, in the middle of a discussion, he had a moment of uncontrollability. He was dealing with a tense situation with another executive, and his frustration was evident. On impulse, he raised his hands to support himself on the table, nearly spilling the contents onto it. The tension in the air was palpable, and everyone in the room stopped to watch Dylan's reaction. He had never been so vulnerable. That was when Julia, without thinking, reached out to support him, to hold him, as a simple gesture, but one that meant more than any words could express. His reaction was immediate, but this time there was no panic. Instead of pulling away, he looked at her with surprise mixed with gratitude, as if he was beginning to understand that her touch was not a sign of weakness, but of support. He didn't have to fight alone. Julia was there, ready to hold him, to help him deal with the difficult moments. "Thank you," Dylan said, his voice softer than she had ever expected to hear from him. And in that moment, Julia knew he was finally beginning to realize that the bonds we form are not built on control, but on mutual trust. It was a huge victory for him, and in some ways for her too. That interaction was a turning point in their relationship. Dylan was no longer the man who withdrew at all costs, who was afraid of any kind of human contact. He was beginning to understand that genuine connections come not from control, but from vulnerability. And with Julia's silent support, he began to open doors to what he had always been afraid to explore. But despite everything, he was still far from being completely free. His fears, his insecurities, did not disappear overnight. Time passed, and gradually Dylan began to allow himself to be more open. His conversations with Julia became more personal, and he no longer saw her as just his assistant, but as someone who, without asking for anything in return, was there to support him. However, there were still times when the old mask of control would lift, when he felt threatened or insecure. At those moments, he would withdraw again, isolate himself. But Julia knew how to deal with that. She didn't force anything. She was just there, patient, willing to wait for the right moment for him to feel comfortable enough to take the next step. One day, at the end of a meeting, Dylan asked to speak to Julia. His tone was different, more serious, but not in a distant way. When she walked into his office, he was standing, staring out the window, as if he were bracing himself for something important. She knew something was about to happen. Maybe, finally, he was ready to face his fears once and for all. "I'm not good at asking for help," Dylan began, turning to her with an expression that, for once, wasn't implacable. "But I realized that without you, I never would have gotten this far." Julia looked at him, surprised by his words, but also touched. It was the first time he had been so open about his limitations, so vulnerable in front of her. "It's okay," she replied softly. "You don't have to ask for help for everything, but when you feel like you need it, I'll be here." Dylan watched her for a moment, as if absorbing the meaning of her words. Something seemed to have definitely shifted inside him. "I don't know what happened to make me this way," Dylan said with a wistful smile. "But with you, I feel like I can try to be better, try to be more human." Julia smiled, her eyes shining. Finally, after so long, she knew he was beginning to understand the true freedom that comes from allowing oneself to be vulnerable. The following days brought a new lightness to the work environment. Dylan was slowly shedding the impenetrable facade he had always used to protect himself. Although he was still a man, of great responsibility and expectations, he was beginning to allow himself to be more genuine, especially with Julia. He, who had always distanced himself from people, was now approaching them, albeit cautiously. To Julia, this was a clear sign that he was finally beginning to trust her. One afternoon, while they were working together, something unexpected happened. Julia, who was organizing some stacks of papers on Dylan's desk, accidentally knocked one of them over. The papers flew across the room, falling all over the floor. She immediately bent down to pick them up, but before she could finish, Dylan crouched down beside her. He, who always kept his distance, was there, helping her without hesitation. It wasn't a grand gesture, but for Julia, that small act meant the beginning of something new between them. Dylan, as if he had noticed the surprise in her eyes, said jokingly, "Maybe I need to worry more about your balance. It seems like you have a gift for making everything fall." Julia laughed, feeling a warmth in her chest. It was funny how, with each new step, he became more human. He was still the CEO of a large company, but little by little, he showed himself to be an ordinary man, with insecurities and fears, but also with the courage to face these weaknesses. "Don't worry," she replied with a smile. "I have a unique way of making everything seem more interesting." Dylan looked at her, his eyes shining with a mix of admiration and something else. He seemed genuinely comfortable around her, and Julia somehow felt that he was beginning to understand that he didn't have to be so rigid all the time. He was already making progress, and that was more than she could ask for. But there was something more, a connection that was forming between them, and she knew that in time, the barriers that still existed would disappear completely. As the weeks passed, Dylan continued to challenge his own limitations. He was still far from completely open, but Julia sensed that he was more willing to face his own fears, one step at a time. The changes were subtle but noticeable. When he started to withdraw into himself, she knew he was just trying to maintain control, and instead of pushing him, she let him breathe. But somehow she also knew that he was closer to trusting her than anyone else. One particularly busy day, while discussing the details of an important meeting, Dylan accidentally touched Julia's hand. It was such a simple gesture, but to both of them, it meant so much more. He pulled away quickly, but the look she gave him was enough to show that he knew it was a sign of something. Something deep was brewing there, and Dylan didn't seem so scared anymore. He smiled, as if he wanted to say something, but just didn't know what. Julia just stared back, speechless, but with a smile that said it all. That gesture of closeness, which would have been unthinkable for him before, was not a mistake. It was no longer about control or avoiding physical contact. For Dylan, in that moment, it was more about embracing the connection between them, without fear. He didn't need to be perfect. He didn't need to be invulnerable. He just needed to be real. Finally, Dylan turned to Julia, with a smile she never thought she would see. "I know we have our differences, but you've shown me that I don't have to be afraid to be vulnerable," he said, his voice firm but filled with something she couldn't deny, a genuine sense of gratitude. "I don't know how you did it, but thank you for helping me see that change is possible. You didn't give up on me." Julia felt a wave of happiness wash over her. She knew the road hadn't been easy, but she also knew that at that moment, they were ready to face any challenge, together. "I never gave up on you, Dylan," she replied with a smile that said more than 1,000 words could express. "We're just getting started." And in that moment, Julia realized that true overcoming was not in changing the other person, but in accepting, supporting, and walking alongside the person, helping them to overcome their own barriers. Dylan Carter, the man who seemed untouchable, was finally allowing himself to be touched in all the ways that truly mattered. And Julia, more than anyone, knew that their journey was just beginning. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a like on the videos. Your support allows us to keep sharing impactful and emotional stories. Thank you for being a part of this community.